Good evening. My name is Jonathan. I'm a tutor at Seeds of Literacy. Today we're going to talk about very important and frankly sad moment in American history, and that's the Civil War. There was a lot of lead up to the Civil War that kind of set the stage for this. So, what you see on the screen are the Union and Confederate flags, the two forces here, which this was a fight between Americans. This was the North versus the South. And this, like I said, the stage was set for this kind of right from the founding. The years are 1861 to 1865. So it's less than 100 years after America was founded. And, when the founders created the Constitution and made, the democracy that we have, they weren't really sure how to handle the institution of slavery. And that kind of lingered on for a long time and really was the backdrop for what led to the Civil War. So you have kind of a couple things going on here. I mean, you have changes economically, you have the expansion of the United States. So, in the 1800s, kind of leading up to this moment, the United States was expanding west. They had purchased land from France in the Louisiana Purchase back in 1803. And so they were acquiring land and they were moving west into, what would become the central United States. And so when they were doing that, they really kind of had a decision to make about whether the institution of slavery would push into these territories. And this was a hotly debated issue, and there was not much agreement. There were people that thought slavery was immoral. There were people that thought slavery was necessary for the economy. But, in other countries on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, slavery was getting abolished. And it was an issue that basically was coming down to people that held slaves, especially in the South. They didn't want to let go of this free labor because they were, getting rich off the backs of people that were working in the agricultural sector, basically tending the crops. So let's get into it. Like I said, 1861 to 1865 were really the years of the war. And it was a fight between Americans. It was the North, which were the Union forces, and the South was the Confederacy. So literally just, the United States of America versus a group of states that pulled away, basically called the Confederate States of America. And so this was, like I said, slavery was kind of the backdrop for this. So the 1860 election is really kind of what sparked things here. You have Abraham Lincoln, who was a popular lawyer, who was known for being a man of compromise with a sharp wit. And he was running on this platform of keeping slavery out of these new territories. So the United States is expanding west, but these territories had not yet become states. And President Lincoln's basically saying, look, we are not going to push slavery into these new territories. Now, many people think that President Lincoln was, kind of against slavery, but publicly he was relatively indifferent. I think that he thought if we just stop expansion of slavery, it would eventually die out. And many Southern leaders and Southern slave owners, they had that worry themselves because they were getting rich off the backs of these slaves and they wanted to continue with this slave labor. So they were worried. President Lincoln's thinking, okay, if we just let this die out, maybe it will. And, kind of on the flip side, they were thinking, we don't want this to die out because we want to keep using slave labor on our plantations. And at this time, the United States was the largest slaveholding country in the world. And so the institution of slavery and Lincoln's pledge to not push it into these new territories was kind of really the driving force behind the South's discontent with President Lincoln. So his election really kind of sparked things here. So I was giving you some of this backdrop at the beginning. The United States is pushing into new territory, and each region of the United States is developing its own character. So in the South, there's enslaved African Americans that are working long hours on plantations, basically making money for a small group of rich Southerners. And in these other parts of the country, they're developing in other ways. So, in the 19th century, we have the Industrial Revolution. And so in the North, people were moving away from agriculture, and factories and manufacturing were starting to boom. So you have people in the North kind of becoming more and more hostile to slavery, understanding just how immoral it was, and really kind of moving into this manufacturing sector, where they're working in the factories. So Southerners were kind of the main group of people that depended on slave labor to grow what they called cash crops. And so a cash crop is grown to be sold rather than for personal use. So these aren't people just farming to feed their family. These were big plantations where slaves were out working in the fields, growing tobacco and growing cotton. And even though a lot of Southerners, a lot of just normal people didn't hold slaves, frankly, it was an expensive institution. It was expensive to have slaves and to take care of, people. Obviously, they weren't treated well, but it was still a very expensive thing to have. So it was really mostly just rich Southerners, and many people in charge were preserving this on behalf of those rich Southerners. So, like I said, you have this changing economy, you have this changing workforce, and you have this debate continuing with slavery. And frankly, a lot of people were acknowledging the immorality of slavery, that it's terrible and inhumane. But then you have these Southern plantation owners who had a lot of political control, and they were worried that all this money they're making would be gone if slavery was outlawed. And like I said, it's not necessarily that they were worried about it being outlawed right away, but they worried that Lincoln's idea that he does not want this to continue its expansion would be kind of the beginning of slavery going away here in the United States. So we have this debate, it's continuing on, it's getting more and more intense. There are compromises along the way where, okay, this southern state, this new state can have slavery, but this new northern state can't have slavery. They were all just little quick fixes that never really addressed this issue. And so Lincoln runs on that platform of not expanding the institution of slavery, and he gets elected. And once he gets elected, you have these several southern states that were already disillusioned by the things that he was saying, and they decided that they are going to leave the United States and form a new nation. They saw it happen before when the American Revolution was literally less than 100 years before. They broke off from Britain, and so now you had these people that were angry about this, and they said, okay, well, we can form our own nation as well. And so that formal departure from the United States was called secession, and 11 slave states seceded to form the Confederacy. And so before the war, you had 15 states that allowed slavery, and only 11 of them seceded to the Confederacy. And so the Union ultimately was 23 northern states. 4 slave states stayed in the Union. And this kind of underscores the tightrope that President Lincoln had to walk, because the thing that was most important to him was preserving the United States. So he was not as focused. Obviously, slavery was really the bulk of this disagreement, but he was really focused on keeping the United States together, because if somebody just disagreed with a law and could leave, that's an incredibly weak union, and he was very concerned about that. So he kept some border slave states in the Union, and he really kind of had to walk a tightrope of not pissing them off, and then getting into a situation where he's losing states to the Confederacy, because that would strengthen the Southern cause, and he really wanted this to end quickly, and he wanted them to stay united. So how did this get going? We're not going to get too much into the battles, but I do just want to kind of give you this first shot here. April 12th, 1861, Fort Sumter, South Carolina. So the American government and the American military, they had forts and military installations along the coast of the United States. And one of these was in South Carolina at Fort Sumter. So after the secession by these 11 slave states in the South, they had some military forces that were coming together. They weren't totally built up yet, but they were, starting to formulate their resistance. And they were at Fort Sumter. And so they rallied around Fort Sumter to kind of symbolize their resistance, and they fired shots on the fort. And frankly, they realized that their opportunity was now, because if President Lincoln could have gotten supplies to that fort, then the Union forces probably wouldn't have been able to either hunker down or totally overwhelm these Southern forces. So this Confederate militia took this opportunity. They laid siege to this fort. They took the fort, and the Civil War had officially begun. So I kind of touched on this before. President Lincoln's goal here in the war was save the Union. So not either to save or destroy slavery. So initially, he was not really harping on, you think, slavery is the most awful thing in the history of our country. President Lincoln obviously was doing this for that. He really was trying to preserve the nation. It was a hot button issue, and he wanted it to die out, but he knew that he really was just focused on keeping everybody together. So, and frankly, he thought that this conflict would end quickly, and so did the South. It turned into the bloodiest event in American history. And, I think both sides thought that maybe the other side was underestimating them. I think that the Union forces understandably thought, we are much bigger, we are much stronger. This is a rebellion that will be suppressed quickly. But I think the Confederacy thought, the Union's underestimating us. They don't know how serious we are right now about this secession. And, it kind of turned into a much bigger conflict than I think either side originally contemplated. And, a lot of that is kind of attributed to war tactics. And so the Confederate forces were led by General Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee ultimately became a feared general to the North and incredibly loved to the Confederate cause, because he was a good general and he won a lot of battles. So the Confederate forces were much smaller and lacked just the strength and numbers of the Union. But General Lee understood tactics, he understood terrain, he understood battle techniques, and he ultimately won a lot of battles and really kind of put the Union forces in disarray for a little bit. And frankly, I think that his prowess was known both to Lincoln and to the Union forces generally, because Lincoln asked Lee to lead the Union forces, but General Lee was from Virginia and he was loyal to Virginia, and Virginia had joined the South. So General Lee ended up, running the the Confederate forces. Excuse me. So these battles are taking place. The Confederacy is showing a lot more staying power than they thought, and it gets to a point where President Lincoln is looking to galvanize his side. He's looking to get the Union kind of rallying around a cause. So he waits for a moment where the Union forces get a victory. And then he issues the famous Emancipation Proclamation, saying that all slaves in states fighting against the United States shall be free. Now, he issues this in September of 1862 to be effective in the next year. So this came right after the Battle of Antietam. This was the bloodiest battle of the war. Both sides lost a lot of their armies. They were both in really bad shape. And frankly, this was a big blow to General Lee and the Confederate forces, but they had still won a lot of battles. So Lincoln was really just taking this as an opportunity to give the war a new meaning and a new purpose, and really to get the Union troops united to end this thing once and for all. So I've talked a little bit about this. General Lee, he was feared by the North, he was loved by the South. He lost Antietam, and he was a strong general. He forced them to press on to Gettysburg. And they were caught in a bad situation, and the Union won Gettysburg, and that really kind of turned the tide. Lee himself escaped that battle, but the Confederacy was in really bad shape, and the Union was basically on their way to victory at that point. And it was 4 months after that President Lincoln delivered his famous Gettysburg Address, acknowledging the sacrifices that their forces had made, and urging them to press on. So one of the issues with the Union that kind of kept the Confederacy in this battle a little longer than most was Union forces didn't have a strong leader. So General Lee was a strong leader in the South, but the Union lacked a strong leader for a lot of the war. And then Ulysses S. Grant came along, and Lincoln entrusted the troops to him, and he just pushed a little bit harder. He understood that the resources were vast compared to the Confederacy, and he kept going despite the casualties. And he employed General William Sherman, who also kind of embodied this cruel approach. And he did his famous March to the Sea. So General Sherman and General Grant, they kind of split their armies. General Grant pushed to Richmond, and General Sherman went through Georgia. And he did this thing that he called total war, which was essentially a very cruel, ruthless march through enemy territory where he burned every farm, he burned the city of Atlanta to the ground, he stole cattle, he freed slaves when he saw them. He ultimately destroyed a lot of Confederate strongholds. And so while he is doing that, Grant is making his way to the southern capital, what the Confederacy had recognized as their capital, which was Richmond, Virginia. So the Union forces, they take Richmond, and General Lee basically gets to the point where he knows that it's over. So he met Grant to negotiate surrender at a small farmhouse in Appomattox, Virginia. Grant let the South surrender with dignity to help heal the nation's wounds, which really just means he let the general keep his sword and horse, which was not customary, but this was a unique situation because these were Americans fighting Americans. And so I think that they really thought, anything they can do to expedite the healing process would be a good thing. And that was very important to President Lincoln as well. So we're at the end of the war, and this victory starts to spread throughout the country, and it propels President Lincoln to a second term. So he met with General Grant to talk about, wow, we've just had this war between the North and the South. We're one nation again, technically, but, what can we do to try to heal the nation? And he never really got that chance because April 14th, 1865, he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, an actor that supported the Southern cause. So, despite losing Lincoln, shortly after the war, these three amendments were ratified by the states as ways to kind of formally, protect people of color following, their emancipation and following the end of slavery. So the 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery, which just means that it got rid of slavery as an institution. And then citizenship was extended to anybody that was born or naturalized in the United States. So slaves that were born here were American citizens. And then finally, the 15th Amendment told states that they cannot prohibit voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So former slaves could not be prohibited from voting. So, we had these amendments, but the reality was that while slaves were emancipated, the institution was done, and the Civil War was over, there was still a lot of resistance in the South. The next period of time was referred to as Reconstruction, and it worked to change the social order so blacks and whites could live in a society without slavery. But the reality of it was that the South resisted for many, many years. Southern whites continued to discriminate against people of color, and they found ways around some of these amendments. So, for example, if they wanted to drive people of color away from the polls, they would institute poll taxes or literacy tests or things that they thought certain groups of people would not be able to deal with in order to disenfranchise them, which just means, basically take away their right to vote. And that's just one example, but the resistance in the South and kind of the failure of the North to really see through some of the reforms that they were instituting in the South basically gave rise to the policies of segregation that we saw through the beginning of the 20th century.